This is IVP. This is The Disruptors, a podcast from InterVarsity Press about how faith is changing culture in unexpected ways. I'm Nancy Wong Yoon. I'm a sociologist, a pop culture expert, and a professor at Biola University.
New eyes that look at the world in new ways. New eyes make contact, blue, green, and gray. New eyes I realized I never knew. When you realize feelings you trapped inside of you. New eyes that see the respect you earn.
I am here with my very good friend, G. Hi, G.
Salutations.
G, today I am going to talk to Mike Cosper. He is a writer and podcaster for Christians in a post-Christian world. That is his bio. He is the director of podcasting for Christianity Today, where he produced and hosted the very, very, very popular The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
The drama.
Yes, it was so popular that it ranked at one point the fourth most listened to podcast in the United States, which is just wow, because it's all about this, this church. And I guess as a Christian, I'm surprised and not surprised that it would be so popular. So I'm going to get to talk to him about it.
Workplace drama and whodunit and,
Yes, it's like it's very much a whodunit true crime format, which is interesting. It's like, I think there was all this like dun dun dun, who killed Mars Hill, and
you
so
need the Law and Order like ka-chunk.
Because Mars Hill, I don't know if people have heard of it. I actually personally have never heard of the church, nor Mark Driscoll. But listening to the podcast, it feels very familiar. And even if you just visited, I think, a mega church a few times, the podcast is it resonates completely with, I think, the appeal and the lure of big mega churches and celebrity pastors, and also
charisma.
Yes, the charisma and the edginess, I think, of a lot of pastors that may be very conservative in their ideology, but very kind of casual and fun and punk rock in the music and in the way they dress and in the way they talk. And I think the way the community is kind of, allowed to kind of flourish or get oppressed. I mean, it's just an interesting kind of close look and a very kind of docuseries on, what a Christian church looks like, but also hearing from the pained survivors of a church that has disintegrated. So Mike and I it's funny because I think Mike and my conversation is really supposed to be about that, but then it really, really talked about race, because that is what I love to talk about on this podcast is race and racism and how people of faith. And actually, since Mike Cosper is my one and only white male guest, and also talking about this church that is very toxic, we got to really have, I think, a very fruitful conversation about the state of white evangelicalism. So when I say white Christianity, I mean that the dominant form of evangelicalism, this is in churches, in seminaries, it's shaped by white conservative culture. So, for example, social science survey shows that white evangelicals are more likely to discount structural racism, the effects of slavery, and historical forms of oppression as shaping contemporary inequality. This is more so than whites that aren't religious, as well as people of color. There is also a deep belief within white Christianity in meritocracy and a kind of militant discounting of any kind of privilege that comes with being white. And so this looks like in churches manifests in how white pastors, they will preach reconciliation, but they rarely repent of racist and segregationist past and present. So all these things are manifestations of white evangelicalism. And this type of thinking pervades the society and pervades how we talk about and think about Christianity in its present form.
Oh, very deep. Can't wait to listen.
So, Mike, I love the true crimey format of the podcast with the dun dun dun, who killed Mars Hill? So, for our listeners who don't know, Mars Hill wasn't a person, but was one of the largest evangelical churches founded in 1996 by Mark Driscoll in Seattle, Washington. And Mars Hill grew to 15 branches in 5 states with nearly, somewhere between, 10 to 15,000 visitors on Sundays. But after accusations of bullying, lying, mismanaging church funds, and even plagiarism, Mark Driscoll resigned from Mars Hill in 2014. So that's kind of the general background. So my first question for you, Mike, is why would one of the top Christian magazines in the United States do a podcast about the demise of a church and its founder?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that's been funny because I think there's some assumptions from some people who've been skeptical or critical of the show to say, the CT's trying to sort of whitewash its image, right? Because we profiled Mark and we've done reviews of his books and that sort of thing back when he was in his ministry. But the truth is, what we're observing, my interest in the show was multi-layered. The biggest issue being that this is not a unique story, unfortunately. Now, there are elements of the story that are unique. There are unique elements to Mark's personality, for sure, and to the church itself. But when you look at the heart of the issues of sort of character, leadership, the structure of leadership, the structures that form around a leader like this, they're just happening over and over and over again. And so I'm grateful that CT gave me the time and the space and the opportunity to really dig in and just sort of excavate this particular system, which I think is indicative of what's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, and I was really taken by the fact that I think in maybe the first episode or second, there was this quote or this pointing out that John MacArthur said that people like Mark Driscoll actually prepared the way for a personality like Trump's. And of course, my bells all went off. I was like, whoa, what is going on here? Because I'm not familiar with personalities like Mark Driscoll. I think if I went to a church where he preached, I would just walk out immediately. I wouldn't stay. Sure. But the fact that someone like him is so popular and that he was, I guess, the reason why, and you can tell me more about this, the reason why John MacArthur, who's very, very conservative, said that Mark Driscoll was kind of a predecessor or maybe even a grooming for, the church for someone like Trump, is that he was very crass, right? He yelled a lot. I think if you listen to the podcast, he's just yelling at the top of his lungs at people all the time. He sounds very, he sounds a lot like Trump in the sense of kind of, very not typically kind of your peaceful, sweet pastor, but a very brash and rude and sometimes, mean and toxic person.
I think there's some truth to that. I don't know. I guess I would say I think MacArthur was probably overstating his case on Mark's relevance to evangelicalism as a whole at the time. All right. And I think there's a deep irony, and we mentioned this on the show, but there's a deep irony in the fact that MacArthur said that in 2015 or 16, and then in 2020 was, sort of one of the louder evangelical voices supporting Trump. So,
yeah.
And so I think on that front, we should ask the bigger question of, well, in the end, what role did a person like MacArthur play in paving that ground as well? And I think what I would say where the commonality was between MacArthur and Mark is where you might even see some of that, which is they are combative. They are culture warriors in one form or another, right? They are out there beating their chests, stomping their feet, and they want to make sure that the world knows that they're right and that they won the argument. And so I think it's that projection of strength, that projection of I'm going to win at all costs that kind of comes through, that certainly is something that I think Donald Trump tapped into with, this narrative of where, his constituency being victims and they're tired of losing and he's going to help them and they're going to win. Once they throw their vote his way, they'll start winning again. I see that parallel for sure.
Yeah, this I think in one of the episodes, I think there was a scholar who pointed out that the kind of Cold War was when like this kind of started, where we have to be this toxic masculinity and this kind of idea of a war, right? That we are fighting a war, that Christians have this war. It reminds me of kind of the Crusades. It's like a modern crusade where people feel like that there are whatever elements it is that's infringing upon their truth, and they like to kind of meld that truth into gospel when it's not necessarily so, right? And this it reminds me of when Mark Driscoll, I think, accused his administrative assistant of being a heretic because she dared criticize him. It's this, it's this us against them, and anybody who's against me, I'm going to fight them because this is a war. And that makes so much sense to me in terms of what we're seeing around the country, right? Like the kind of anti-CRT, banning books in the name of morality, in the name of Christianity. And yeah, definitely listening to this it helped me, I think, make sense, because I think a lot of non-Christians are thinking, why are these people who profess to have faith are attacking what they perceive are people on the margins, right? And so this confusion of morality, and yet we see that it's actually the very morality is just it's different, right? I mean, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. I guess the way I've been thinking about this a lot recently is, there seems to be an ethic in a lot of evangelical circles right now, and it seems to be part of what I think is being worked out in the debates and in the politics of the moment, of sort of what it's a constant debate is, what does faithful Christian witness look like, right? And in some ways, I just feel like we all need to go back and reread James Davison Hunter's, to change the world, because part of the whole point of his book is that, the whole idea of world-changing Christianity, this sort of grandiose vision of, if we get our evangelistic plans right, and we build the right institutions and we do the right things, we're going to sort of inaugurate a new realm of Christendom. As opposed to this idea, which I think is much more biblical, much more evident historically, which is that faithful witness is faithful presence. That Christian witness is always kind of the witness of a remnant inside of society, and that remnant being a source for an immense amount of good and being life-giving and restorative. But it's a narrative that I think is really weird for our current moment, because for white evangelicals in particular, they're sort of flourishing in their positions of power and influence in society has been so married to their understanding of themselves as evangelical Christians, that as those dynamics change, as the politics change, as the demographics change, and all of that, there's an assumption that all Christian witness is disappearing with it. So yeah, I think in terms of how it connects to some of these bigger questions of presence, like tactics, the way we communicate, the way we connect. There's a reactivity that gathers around someone like Driscoll or gathers around someone like Trump and says, sees the strength, the projected strength and all of that, and thinks that this is what we need in order to preserve what we understand to be the true faith. And in fact, we're being had at one level or another when we buy into that narrative.
Yeah. So then that true faith is wrapped up in racial identity, even though I think because it's not named so, there's this very kind of staunch defense of, like, I've been told that I should identify as Christian first and not as Asian, and or not as Asian, but just like Asian second, right? Or it's not as important as my Christian identity. And it's hard for me to convince the people that say that to me that, well, I think all Christian identities intersecting with some sort of racial identity in this country. And just because you don't say I'm a white Christian, that is right now, I think, the understanding, at least when they're saying that to me, that's the understanding that they're coming from. And so because of that, then whiteness becomes this defense of quote unquote truth, right? And that, I think that, yes, I think people understand that, but I think that, or everybody understand that's that's an issue that we're dealing with right now. But I think that what I'm trying to get at is that there's a morality to that, right? That I think that there's such a staunch defense and such a moral kind of rage behind that, then that fuels this kind of anti-CRT, which is critical race theory, any kind of books that really any history that deals with racism, the actual history of the United States. And so having all of that, it feels like, I think it's almost like our moral centers are now different, right? Not just politics, but the moral centers are sometimes even oppositional, even within the Christian community, but certainly between kind of Christians and non-Christians. So yeah, it's troubling. And I think that that's what this podcast really helps to, I think, pull back the curtains on why this is so. And I think that's really effective. And perhaps that's why I'm imagining there's a lot of audiences that aren't Christian that are listening to it, right? Have you gotten a lot of feedback from non-Christians about the podcast?
Yeah, I have. I'd love to say something about what you just said, because I think it's really important. So much to me, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but like so much to me about the way people, both as individuals and as groups, sort of understand themselves in culture is through like the narrative, right? The stories that they're telling themselves, right? And so, I saw some data the other day that Ryan Burge had written about sort of the evangelical populations in the United States. And it was so interesting because what he shows in the research is that the actual number of evangelicals is staying pretty flat. But the number of white evangelicals is declining. And that's a factor of birth rate and people leaving the church. It's actually a factor as much as birth rate as anything, which I was pretty blown away by that as well. And so as I've thought about that, and he talks about it a bit in his article, part of what I think white evangelicals are feeling is this decline narrative. Like we're shrinking, we're losing something, and I don't think they would name it an issue of power. I think they would name it an issue of sort of influence. And there is this divide. There is this difficulty in the church that non-white evangelicals don't vote the same. They don't think the same about all kinds of issues. They don't think about education in the same ways. They don't think about lots of stuff. And so many of those sort of cultural issues that really should live in the realm of sort of Christian liberty, freedom of conscience, all of that kind of stuff. They've been so narrowly defined for a middle and upper middle class white evangelical demographic that when the conversation starts to shift, there's a lot of fear and a lot of reactivity. Yeah. And so I think that's why a lot of those, when they're confronted with it as a racial narrative, their first reaction is always, well, I'm not racist, because they're not thinking in terms of race in the story, because their story that they've bought into and that they own and experience most closely is decline. And I think it's really hard. I've thought a lot about it since then, of how do you help to tell a story in a way that is a positive story, that we're seeing, a more diverse and a more beautiful church. And are there ways that we can have more open hands to seeing, holding the essentials together, and that classic cliches about essentials and non-essentials and all that. But to your question, I've had a lot of non-Christians reach out, and people who've left the church or struggled or been on a deconstruction process reach out. And, I think, like you said at the beginning, there's a lot of surprise that, why would an evangelical institution like CT spend time on this, and some gratitude for it. And then I think there's just a lot of people at various stages of faith and lost faith who've reached out and said, thanks for telling our story. Like this, I lived this. Thank you for sharing it with others. And meaning they've lived it in other contexts. And again, that's back to why we think it's just so important to have invested in it.
Yeah, it feels like a confessional, right? Because I think that, oh gosh, living through kind of these years of Trump and post-Trump and seeing kind of, I think a lot of Christians and evangelicals and people who are questioning what is going on with kind of the culture of evangelical Christianity, and being able to have this podcast to say, hey, this is what the shape of how these problems look like lived out in the specific story of Mars Hill, and to actually say it, in terms of like the toxic masculinity and misogyny. I mean, I just thought, wow, like why? It's like I think a lot of your the segments were actually all like publicly available, right? These are from sermons. Like he had no problems that that he's saying things like blaming wives for the sins of their husbands, that they have to be totally sexually available, otherwise their husbands are going to sin. I mean, it sounds like something that's like from like 1940s or something.
Yeah. Wow.
And yet I was shocked that it was such a successful church and there were women there. I just thought, like, what kind of people, and of course they were victimized and but what kind of people would even go here? Like, these are young people, right? It was a young, and it's in Seattle, Washington, so I would imagine somewhat diverse. Like, what were the people like that were at Mars Hill? Are they representative of evangelical Christians and like you said, the changing demographics as well?
Yeah, when it comes to some of the sort of sexuality teaching at Mars Hill, there are ways in which Mark's an outlier because he's so, for lack of a better term, vulgar in the sense that he's unrestrained in the pulpit in terms of what he would say. And there's a famous example of a sermon he gave in it's the Scottish Song of Songs sermon. And if you read like sort of old blogs on Mark, like when that sermon found its way online, it was one of the more controversial moments in the history of the church. And we used some clips from it. And just the degree of almost pornographic detail he goes into as a way of trying to interpret Song of Solomon, it's kind of stunning. But it's not that stunning when you look at the way a lot of Christian writing on sexuality has been since the 1970s. There's lots of Christian books on married, sort of the married versions of the joy of sex and whatnot. And so I think in the name of sex positivity, a lot of Christians have embraced it over the years. And I think what ends up being difficult is when an attempt at sex positivity gets married to an understanding of male sexuality that, like at Mars Hill, it was very transactional. Men need this. Women need a provider. Men need sex. So this is how it works. This is the exchange. And it was never that overt, like that's an overstatement. But I mean, that was definitely the message that many received. So it connected with people at a certain level. I think there were a lot of folks who were Christians who came to the church and who were just glad someone was talking about sex at all, because they felt like they'd come from contexts where it was faux pas. And I think in a way that's similar, I think Caitlin Beatty has used the language of like a sexual prosperity gospel. Where it's like, if you get if you do these things right, the Lord will bless your sex life. And so I think there's a lot of people who were drawn in by that pursuit, men and women. So it as far as the broader demographics of the church, it was predominantly white by far. And they made efforts at from time to time to have a more diverse church, and they planted in a more diverse neighborhood at one point, but the plant just didn't work. I mean, Mark's preaching just didn't translate to a predominantly black community at all. And yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to nail down exactly who, even amongst sort of that white population, who was there though, because there were a lot of converts. There were a lot of Christians who'd left the church and kind of came back because the culture of Mars Hill felt like home for them. And then as the church got bigger and bigger, just a lot of evangelicals who were attracted to kind of the big, the phenomenon of the megachurch in the first place, found their way there.
The world keeps changing at a dizzying pace. How can you stay current and discover biblical truths to meet today's challenges? Introducing Seminary Now, a new online, on-demand streaming service where you can learn from gifted teachers like Esau McCauley.
When we look at the injustice in the world, we're going to address the perennial issue of slavery. And we're going to talk about the ways in which the Bible was misused to justify the oppression of Black and brown people.
Brenda Salter McNeil.
The world as God intended is a multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and multinational place.
James Chong.
What is the gospel? Is it just about where you go when you die?
The world keeps changing. Don't stop learning. Join Seminary Now at seminarynow.com and get 25% off with the discount code DISRUPTORS25. That's DISRUPTORS25.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about my own church life. I've definitely gone to churches where I disagreed with sermons or disagreed, or I knew I disagreed with leaders on aspects that I just decided that wasn't as important as perhaps the community or as other issues. And that's actually, I think that's kind of confusing to people who live in kind of a cancel culture on both sides, right? Where it's like, if you don't agree with me on all things, I'm not going to be here. But I feel like people who have been churched, it's almost impossible to find a community where you agree with everything that the pastor agrees with, right? And that's not necessarily a bad or good thing. I'm just saying that helps me to process why people would go to a church where I was. Another shocker was that the elders all had to have stay-at-home wives. The elders had to be men, and they all had to have stay-at-home wives. And I've myself been to like weekend marriage things where they separate the husband and the wives. And when I was in the women's portion, they told us that the speaker said that, you shouldn't work. And I'm sorry if your husband makes you work because that's sinful. And I remember sitting there and looking around the room like, is anyone else hearing this? And no one said anything, no one said anything. And how we just are quiet about it because, again, it's under the umbrella, under the guise of this is what the Bible says, right? And so if you say anything, then you are kind of like you're saying you're not a Christian, even if you're just disagreeing with one portion. So there is this all or nothing mentality, and that you just learn to kind of negate parts of yourself or be silent about parts of yourself in order to kind of fit in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as the church, as the life of the church went on, I think you probably found fewer and fewer people who could compartmentalize the way you're talking about. Certainly people who were there early when Mark, was 27, 28, 29 years old and was just sort of their loudmouthed guy who was in the crew, right? It's easy when that's your context to hear him say something that's totally over the top. One of the descriptions we had for him at one point was, Archie Bunker in an Affliction t-shirt, right? Like when you have the relational context to hear him say something that's kind of ridiculous, you roll your eyes and you go, not only do I not necessarily believe that, I know you don't really believe that. That's for the reaction. But then again, like the success of the church, the size of the church, the scale, the distance he got from people, that he made from people, I think there comes a point where, number one, there's not context for people to know when to roll their eyes and when he's being serious. But I also think for Mark, probably it reaches a point where that line between truth and fiction in his own head starts to disappear, because he's surrounded by people who don't have a vested interest in keeping him connected to reality anymore. And I think that's really hard. But yeah, you said you stay because of community. That's the thing we heard over and over and over again. Like, why did you stay? It's like, my kids were born here. I was married here. Like, my best friends are here. Like, when I got sick and was in the hospital, these were the people that brought me meals and food and everything else. And it's like, sure, I've got scars from this, that, and the other along the way, but I didn't know where else I was going to go.
Before we continue this conversation, I want to let our listeners know about two things. First,
Recapturing the Wonder by Mike Cosper is available for 30% off plus free U.S. shipping. Just use the promo code DISRUPT at ivpress.com. Secondly, hosting the Disruptors podcast has been the most unexpected blessing for me. As I interviewed cultural disruptors about how they integrate faith with their creative justice and identity work, I began to understand how my identity as a Christian is shaped and fortified by who I am as an Asian American woman, scholar, and activist. I hope that you have enjoyed Season 3 as much as I have, and your feedback matters. It can shape the future of the show. So as we wrap up Season 3, our team wants to get to know you better. We're asking our listeners to take a quick survey so that we can better understand who you are, which episodes you enjoy the most, and what conversations you're interested in moving forward. Plus, when you take the survey, you'll be entered to be one of 5 lucky winners to win a $25 Amazon gift card. Take the survey today at ivpress.com/disruptors. That's ivpress.com/disruptors. And thanks for listening to the Disruptors podcast. And it's so painful to leave a church and start over. Like I've done that a few times in my life, and it's so hard, especially as you get older. It's really, really hard to find a community, because if you're with people your age, they've been friends in that community for a really long time, and to be the new person, it's really hard, really, really hard. And so I get that. The idea of staying, but I don't know. I just, everything that you just said about kind of this the not being part of reality because you're with a group of people that maybe just support all of your thinking that is actually maybe wrong, and I feel like that's the problem, right? That especially what we talked about earlier, where there's a fear of kind of difference encroaching in the minds of some white evangelical Christians, that then that it's reproduced, right? This idea that okay, like anything that talks about racism is anti-gospel, like these kind of lies that get reproduced because you're only surrounding yourself with other people who think the same thing, rather than having a true dialogue, and this mistrust and this fear of the other, I feel like is so endemic in our current climate. And I don't know, what do you think is a solution to all of this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I certainly don't have a solution. I think one of the causes that's interesting, or one of the things that I'm interested in thinking more about, and is just the way that, like, the sort of the blessing of the internet. I mean, this is a perfect example of it, right? Like we're gonna have this conversation. It's gonna go online, and anybody's gonna have access to it who wants to. Being able to get your message out to whoever wanted to access it, 25 years ago even, was incredibly difficult. Your best bet was like a mailing list, right? Because then, especially you go back a little further, you go back 40, 45 years ago, there's 4 TV networks. And so there's the gatekeepers to get to that, to communicate, were so difficult. On the flip side, for the networks themselves, their goal is to get to as broad an audience as possible. And so they're not incentivized to be flame throwing and to play to the most sort of polarized minorities by minorities, I mean sort of viewpoint minorities in the crowd. As communication gets broader and broader, there's more networks, there's more access. We can podcast. There's 500 cable news channels now, and each one crazier than the next one in one degree to another. It's like the incentives are all go towards saying something inflammatory, so that you get noticed, so that you get heard. And I mean, I don't think the solution is like, some kind of authoritarian shutdown of all the stuff. And, I don't even know what that would look like, but I do think it's a significant contributor to the problem. We don't have responsible actors in media and communications on secular world, Christian world, whatever, because the incentives are all for being flamethrowers and inciting the most devout minority in the crowd.
Yeah, and I think I think there's also this inclination towards, I don't want to be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
if it's comfortable, then it's probably truth. If it's uncomfortable, then it's a lie, right? This kind of very narrow thinking. I mean, there's literally laws that are, bills being proposed to eliminate any texts that make white people feel uncomfortable. And that's like when I'm reading that, like, I feel like I live in discomfort all the time. As a Christian of color, I am never comfortable. And so I'm used to it, right? I'm used to being in ambivalence and, in tension. And yet, I keep the faith, and I just think like, wow, how can we have that kind of attitude? How can we cultivate that kind of attitude, right, throughout the church, where being uncomfortable is part of, actually, I mean, if we're just sharing the gospel anyway, that should be uncomfortable because, right now. And I think that the problem is, I don't know, I wonder if evangelicalism has moved away from actually sharing, right? Sharing with people that are unlike yourself, more isolating and being with other people who think just like you. Right. That's where the culture has shifted. And that is obviously not biblical. And so I think that, that's part of the issue with, with kind of a bubble mentality. And then at the same time, though, just think about Marcel, that it was about growth, right? It was about reaching a lot. And I think that even listening to Mark Driscoll's kind of message, like he wanted to be in the pulpit in order to spread the word. That was his goal, right? But then it was so narrow, and he would yell at people who didn't believe the same thing he did. It's like creating, I don't know, I guess creating clones of yourself, right? It's like you want to spread the word, but you only want people who are going to believe exactly what you believe. So I don't know, that just was not how I came to faith. I mean, I didn't grow up in a Christian family, so that would not have drawn me to, to the faith.
Right. Yeah. And it's a principle that evangelicals adopted from, the name is slipping my mind, but there was a missiologist at Fuller Seminary for a long time who his whole concept was, this homogeneous unit principle that, missionaries in the field, you need to understand the language and the dialect and the local culture and all of that, which of course all makes sense. And then he comes back to the States and says, well, this should shape the way we do church planting. And so if you're planting in a white suburb, of Chicago, like learn to speak that language, be as precise and particular to that space and those people and all of that. And so I think that plays in a lot to, why churches struggle. Like why do churches struggle so much to thrive as multi-ethnic communities? I think a big part of it is because so much of their strategy and so much of the training around church planting and church growth has been designed to say, the classic example is like Saddleback Sam for Saddleback. I mean, they designed a character that was the target for all of the church's growth. And he was an upper middle class white guy. And so they built all the ministries around let's serve him, right? It's like, well, now ask yourself, why would ethnic minorities have a hard time connecting to life at Saddleback? Maybe it's because they're not Saddleback Sam. And I think the sad part is, I don't say this as a critique of Rick in particular, because it was just in the water. It was what all the churches were doing at the time. But I think the sad thing is that it pervaded in such a way that it just seems like right now churches just really lack the imagination to go, well, how could it look different? To the point where you see, I've seen in recent years people arguing, the multi-ethnic thing just doesn't work. You can't do it, so don't try. Which is just surprising to me. And on some levels I understand, because when I hear, like, I've read that from some Black Christians who are essentially saying, I've come home to the Black church because it's a safe space for me and I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of fighting for my dignity or for my point of view and all of that. And I completely understand that. I think that's an indictment on white evangelicalism that our standard mode of operation drives people away from us, that they feel like they can't be home with us. So
Yeah, so like sociological studies of multi-ethnic churches is that the people of color start to assimilate into the white culture and not the other way around, right? So it's like if you're going to be a person of color and thrive and survive in a white evangelical led church or a multi-ethnic that's still led by white men mostly, that then you will have to assimilate into that culture, right? And so I can see how if you don't want to assimilate into that culture, then there's really no space for you because the leadership tends to not invite, right, the people that are on the margins and to actually have a truly multicultural leadership. That doesn't happen as much. And also a lot of the pastors of color are also, coming out of seminaries that also teach them to assimilate into a certain culture, right, into the dominant culture. And so that makes it very hard, I think, to have true dialogue and true mutual understanding and expansion of what church life and church culture can look like. I was talking so I'm going to circle back to my very first guest, Jean Luen Yang, who grew up Catholic, and he talked about how Asian American churches were kind of coverings for Asian American culture to thrive in the United States because people won't bother them because they're like, oh, well, they're Christians, right? But in fact, they could actually practice a lot of Asian American culture and, holidays and whatever rituals that were brought from the homeland in ways that they wouldn't be suspicious, right? And so so there is something interesting about, I think, the place of ethnic churches and where certain cultures can thrive because there isn't kind of a pushback or, or silencing even.
have you seen where in multi-ethnic churches where the leadership is predominantly minority, does that make a difference at all in kind of the outcomes of the churches, outcomes of the populations?
Yeah, I think it definitely makes a difference in terms of the population. Like I went to a multi-ethnic church that had a Filipino American pastor, and I really appreciated the sermons. I appreciated the openness, but there was definitely pushback, right? Like I think he would get critiqued if he, criticized white supremacy or something like that. Like he started to lose some of the white members, right? So, and so it's really hard, I think, to have a true multi-ethnic church, and eventually that church even. It dissipated, and not because of any controversy, nothing like Mars Hill, but just that it was really hard to have community when there was also differences in positions on sexuality. It was a very diverse church in lots of different ways, but I think because there's so much polarization in the evangelical world and in Christian world and society, it's really, really hard, I think, to have people who feel differently about each other, but then makes it less safe if you feel like, oh, this person doesn't believe in this, and that actually negates my very center of identity, right? And so it's really hard, I think, to have people who can be, I think, bound by Christian love when there are so many, I think, political things that actually seem to be hateful, right? And so I think we're in a stage of, really kind of a reckoning of, what do we believe in and how do we enact Christ's love in the world?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I take away from the whole Mars Hill story is, back to some of the things we were saying earlier, is I think so much about the people who left disillusioned. Their marriages ended up failing and falling apart, and they struggled to find a home in another church. And or people who've described, like, I wanted to go back to church, but I walked in the doors of another church and I either started shaking with anxiety from just previous experiences, or I felt this sort of inward pressure of sort of guilt or shame or anxiety about, like, they're not going to be right. They're not going to get something right. And I think the reason for that, like, so much of it was because at the heart of Mars Hill was Mark had this message of, we're special, we're unique, we're blessed by God, we've got it all right. If you do what I say, your life's going to work out, And it wasn't a prosperity gospel in the sense of give us your money and God's going to bless you, but it was in the sense of these are your 12 rules for life or whatever that are going to work perfectly for you. And I just keep coming back to this, like, why are we as Christians so allergic to the message of the cross, which is follow Jesus, aka follow someone who suffered and died, and that was the path to glory. That was the path to goodness. Like, human flourishing comes when it's full of people who are not in it for themselves, not in it to win, not in it to dominate. And so I think about these racial conversations a lot, and we've dealt with some of this stuff at the church where I was a pastor. We made efforts to try and build multi-ethnic bridges, and have had some successes with it, and especially since a new pastor came in, an African-American pastor who's been amazing. But the degree of sort of reactive vitriol when you just bring it was like, I remember preaching a sermon one time on Ephesians 2, breaking down the walls of hostility. And to me, it was like, well, this is just in the text, and here's our situation. I went into it so naive about what was going to happen when you preached about racism. And oh my gosh, I'll just never forget that couple of days afterwards of the reactivity. And then I think fundamentally it comes back to this whole thing of like, we want to win. We want to be told we're right. And we don't want to be put in a position where we're being called to lay down our lives for our friends and neighbors. So,
yeah, I think, a lot of the areas, I live in the suburbs, and a lot of the suburban churches, it's like, they're really fun, the music is fun, sounds like a rock concert. The Sunday school is, so sweet, and everything is about feeling good. That is what attracts people in the suburbs for sure, and perhaps everywhere. I don't know. And I think that has become, I think, church culture. And you're right. That is so not the kind of why someone becomes a Christian in the first place. I think I was drawn as a young person to the idea of unconditional love, right? And if we're going to mimic unconditional love, I mean, not out of our own ability, but out of kind of a constant communion with a loving God, then yes, that means that we have to give of ourselves, and that immediately is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable and painful, and I get it, because I think the thing is, it's counter to the American dream, right? And this is where the kind of Christian nationalist agenda, I think, moves in, right? Where it's about achieving a dream. It's about having a certain degree of comfort and lifestyle. And I think Donald Trump really represented that, because he was so wealthy, and his whole kind of reality show persona was about, making money. And then he said he was Christian. And then it was like, everything just made sense, I think, to a huge swath of people. Right. And for those of us who, like, what you said, believe in more of the sacrificial kind of following of Christ, is like standing by in horror, right? Like just aghast. And I think to this day, I'm still like not in shock, because I'm trying to understand, and I'm starting to really understand why Christianity kind of gets mixed up in that. But and not Christianity, I think, in terms of capital C Christianity, but a form of Christianity, right? Yeah. But it's so painful, I think, for those of us who see that now as what people think of when they think of Christianity. They think of that rather than what you just said, the kind of beauty of following someone who was crucified because he wanted to make a difference in the world, and uphold those who are in the margins and those who are not well but sick, right? And so I think that message now is starting to get lost. It's starting to get lost, and that's really painful for me.
Yeah, and I think I think the American dream is a great way to frame it as well, because it's it's like an imminent eschatology, right? It's like that's something I can put my hope in, and it's tangible and it's real, and I can in whatever. And so if we put up anything that feels like an obstacle in the way of that, I'm a big believer in sort of the Charles Taylor framing of living in a secular age, and the limits of our moral imagination and spiritual imagination and all of that. And so I think there's probably something to the degree to which, a message that pulls us away from that kind of a vision of prosperity taps into a deeper fear about our futures, because that's a hope that I believe in, where I'm not quite so sure about, the sort of the resurrection hope, which is at the heart of the Christian story, because it's the resurrection that makes any invitation to die to self worth pursuing, worth embracing. It's a phrase my friend David Zoll says all the time. He says, with every death in Christ, there's a resurrection. And so anything we experience in our lives, it's like, I can die to that. I can let this part of my story, or I can let this preference. I mean, that's the thing that's crazy to me, right? Like when we talk about the culture of our churches and what's difficult to sort of create hospitality and make room for other leaders and all of that, we're often talking about culture issues, expression issues, language, music, whatever it might be. And it's like, I can't die to myself we're not asking you to open your wallet even necessarily. It's like, can you give up the kind of music you like on a Sunday to make room for people who are different? And you can't die to yourself for that. Like, no wonder we can't build bigger bridges in our culture. Christians divide over the craziest things. It's the old cliche about, churches splitting over the carpet color in a new building. It happens. And it's just such a tragedy of missing the point.
Yeah. And I think as a person of color that's gone to multicultural churches, it's like, the music is just one indication of so many things, right? Like being mistaken for, the only other Asian around, or all the kind of microaggressions add up to, or actually what I usually get is like, oh my gosh, I had a Chinese international student stay with me. Do you know her? Or have you met her? Or I think you would have totally gotten along with her. And just this, those are kind of the positive kind of framing of just seeing me for my race. And it's like those things, those divisions, they add up to make you feel like, oh gosh, I just don't belong here, and I'm never going to be loved for who I am. I can never really truly connect and feel like this is my home. Like those kind of things happen so often. But then you have now, like those are things that I feel like a lot of us are used to, Christians of color and women. But then you get into now, it's like, I don't want to hear about like any kind of history where you suffered in this country, or people that look like you suffered. Like there's total erasure now, and there's total hostility, right? So it's like escalated to a point where it's really hard to kind of overlook, those kind of things. It's like it's high stakes, right? Where I feel like, that my very soul, or being told that I can't identify as Christian and Asian, like being told that like parts of myself aren't valid, right? And it feels very satanic. It does not feel like coming from God, right? And so I think that, that's where we are in terms of a lot of experiences of, I know my listeners and here on the Disruptors, and just my friends and my family, this kind of wariness of white Christianity that's dominating so many churches right now.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, as I've wondered about it, and I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He's kind of a mentor of mine. He's 90 years old, been a part of the church forever, and we were talking about this. We were talking about some of these leadership things, and I was like, so what do you think? What do we do? Like what do we make of all of this stuff? And and his response is, well, just some things only come out by prayer. And I think there's an element of me that I hear that, and I want to sort of react and be cynical and say like, oh yeah, okay, the Sunday school answer, prayer, right?
Thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts and prayers. But and that was my reaction in the moment, and but I found myself kind of haunted by it, and coming back to, what you just said about like it feels satanic. Well, it feels satanic because it is satanic. These divisions are satanic. They are satanic, and the message of the idea that the gospel is supposed to be capable of building racial or of bridging racial and ethnic divide, like that's not an innovation of the 21st century. That's in the message of Jesus. There's a reason he told a story about a Samaritan. That story was offensive to his listeners. How many times does Paul talk about it in his letters? This is at the heart of the gospel message, is that it should be building these kinds of bridges. And so, I think when we're putting up walls and creating resistance to it at any level, the confrontation really needs to come back to, hey, it's almost like we should say to those who want to resist that, hey, just preach the gospel. By the way, the gospel message is that it builds bridges between people groups who normally have hostility and who other one another and alienate one another. And it's heartbreaking that it's so hard to be heard when you say something so basic.
Yeah, and I think that for me, it's also a decentering of power, decentering of privilege, and I think that having, that it's, that yes, there's hostility, but sometimes there's hostility, plus power, right? In terms of who has the power to be able to kind of enact hostility that actually will exclude people from churches and from places that they should be welcome at, and how about recentering it on ethnic churches where they can have spaces where they can grow, and I think that having those kind of conversations and being really humble and open and listening, I think those are such basics, but I find that people are not doing that in the church, and people are not doing that in the communities that are supposedly Christian. And so I think that Mars Hill is a great start in kind of exposing what some of these risks are, right? And these kind of deep sins and what the shape of that. Obviously, it's an extreme version, but I think the fact that it's resonated with so many people that it definitely touches upon a lot of what is going on, not just in the church, but in, I think, our society in terms of, kind of this, again, kind of a Christian nationalism that we are in the heart of right now. So I always ask guests, what are you listening to, watching, or reading that is disruptive? I mean, the Mars Hill podcast is very disruptive, I think, in a very fruitful way. Are there other things that you have come across that is disruptive?
I'm in the middle right now of the new podcast from Serial about this. There was a hoax. The name of it, I think, is the Trojan Horse Affair. It's about a hoax about an Islamic conspiracy to sort of undermine education in Great Britain, and it had wide-reaching effects and all of this. And at the heart of it was this letter that was a fraud about this conspiracy theory. And it's a crazy story because this letter comes out, launches these investigations, all these people lose their jobs, and becomes apparent very quickly in the podcast, the letter's fake. And people knew the letter was fake and they didn't care. And so there's a lot to it about sort of racial assumptions and sort of post 9/11, conspiracy theory, suspicion of Muslims, that sort of thing that I've really found fascinating as I've listened to that.
You guys covered a lot there, Nancy. I'm interested, having listened to the rest of the season, what kind of sets this interview apart, at least in your mind?
Talking to Mike Cosper as someone who has investigated and told the story of, Mars Hill, which although the podcast itself didn't necessarily deal with race so much, it really was about, I guess, toxic masculinity and toxicity, the kind of lures and pitfalls, right? And I think that in this interview, I was really interested because I think the entire season of all the people of color that I got to speak to, the elephant in the room really was and is kind of white evangelicalism, right?
Yeah.
And to kind of name it with Mike was risky, I think, in a lot of ways, because I think we don't, if you're ensconced in evangelicalism, people don't like to talk about race at all, and to name how evangelicalism has become, I think, part of integrated with whiteness and with patriarchy, and I think because all the guests throughout the whole season, that was what they were defining themselves against, right?
Yeah,
so it's like,
whiteness is
who
always
am I?
the middle.
Yeah, who am I? Well, because that is, I think, the default culture that evangelicalism has become, especially in the public eye, with kind of the rise of Donald Trump and all the supporters.
The explicit white
and
nationalism.
That's right. And I think that, me coming out of, a conservative university, I know that like there's people who probably don't want me to talk about this, right? But there are also a lot of people who recognize it and need it to be named, because I think a lot of people are suffering, right? And also having a lot of tension and questions about who am I as a Christian? If not, someone who aligns with one single party who claims to, be the party of Christianity, when there are so many parts of that morality that doesn't fit with who I think Christ's, mission and calling for me is.
Right.
So that's it's a really hard place and tension to be in. And I think I appreciated being able to talk to Mike and kind of deconstruct with Mike what that means and hear his perspective, right? And also I think challenging him as well and thinking about, because he talked about building bridges, and building bridges also assumes that there's an equivalency, right? But I believe that there is a power differential, right, when it comes to who gets to speak for Christians today and who has to speak in kind of whispered corners or speak out, but then be challenged in ways that you're not Christian because you're talking about race. It's like they call it wokeism, or call it, CRT, whatever the words that have been labeled, all the kind of challenges to dominant Christianity that has marginalized voices of color and all the kind of groups that are trying to say, hey, we don't fit in. We are constantly silenced, and yet having this tension. And I think that that all those and all the hurt that comes with that, right? And I think that all the guests, I've been inspired by all the guests who continue to want to emulate Christ's love, like Minjin Lee saying she's team love, right? and I think, and also I think Jing Luan Yang talking about the history of Christianity not being white, completely white, right? But that it has lots of big names and origins that are rooted in people of color and coming from the Middle East. And I think that, having this decentered, I think that's what this season has been, decentering mainstream white Christianity, evangelicalism, and recentering voices on the margins, just like Jesus did.
And I think, in some ways, white evangelicalism needs that stretching in some ways. The scholars of color, the church people of color, they're doing it all the time naturally because, whiteness being centered, that's not our lived experience. We always have to stretch to accommodate that. And then I remember when I went to church in the Midwest during grad school, and I would always point out to people, oh, you do that because you're white. And they would be like, no, I do that because, this is like how we always do it. And I'm like, I know. And it's because you've always been white. and it was really interesting and I'm so thankful to many of those friends for still staying friends with me and learning from me, challenging them and asking them to think, is this a Christian thing or is this the white thing, right? And I know that for many of the other interviewees, like I think of Angry Asian Man and, the Rise book and Jeff Yang saying, hey, we think about how culture intersects with Christianity and which parts are from Jesus and which parts are from like our love of boba or whatever, But I think, it's a new thing for a lot of white Christians to have to grapple with that.
I mean, I even feel kind of strange saying that we're ending the season, on a white dude explaining white Christianity or something.
Yeah.
That this is again, I think not, and me, also I think speaking up and trying to center the kind of season that I've been doing and thinking about how do we coexist? How do we become one in Christ truly? I mean, we can't be the same. That isn't possible.
Right.
And it's not desirable.
Nope.
That's not what, in the Bible, we are hands, we are feet, we are eyes, we are ears, we are all these things. And to come together, perhaps not always harmoniously, but I think that to understand that we are one body with different purposes, with different perspectives, that is the beauty of being Christian, right? I love hearing from people who are different, but at the same time, being at Biola, I have felt connections and safety with people who are different than myself, knowing that we will love one another, even if we disagree.
Yeah.
And this isn't always so. I don't always feel safe with everyone, but I do feel safe with, for example, people of color who are different backgrounds than I, that we try to, talk about our shared love, but also our shared marginality. And that has been so beautiful. And I think that this season has been really that, just listening and hearing and discussing how we can be better in the body, even as we are celebrating our differences, and also mourning, I think, some of how the pain that comes with having that distinctiveness and the diversity that isn't always celebrated in every circle. So I think we've done all of that. I'm proud. I'm proud that we were able to do that.
We mix our colors like we cover pop songs in a bottle, how we battle all the barriers, right? Some drink, some color their hair every night. Some try to stand out, some try to act white. Found music, but I've never been the stereotype. New eyes break old lies. New skin means new wine.
Thank you for listening to The Disruptors. The Disruptors is hosted by me, Nancy Wong Yoon. You can follow me at Nancy, WYUEN. Our theme song is New Eyes by Jason Chu. Our executive producers are Helen Lee and Andrew Bronson. Produced by Richard Clark, Cray Allred, and Mila Kim.